although one of my interests is in the whole area of parenting leave, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. And today I'm going to talk about another area of my interest, which is education. So I'll talk more about the leave work tomorrow. I really like to thank Jarina and the department for inviting me to Prague. It's such a beautiful city. And as a historian, which is my background, it's so full of history. It's just amazing to be here. And I'd like to thank you all for listening to me in English. I'm always very conscious that that makes it very easy for me, and it makes it quite difficult for you. So I try and remember that all the time. And I want you to say, if I'm not clear, please put a hand up or shout or say, I don't understand, and I will try and clarify what I say. I will not be offended. Please interrupt. Also, my PowerPoints, I understand, will be available to you. So you don't need to try and, copy them all as I go. And I thought I'd just introduce myself before we get going. I'm also aware there are a few people online as well. So hello to you, and I hope you can follow me and hear me very well. Okay. So nearly all of my working life and my retired life, I have been at a place called the Thomas Coram Research Unit, which is at the Institute of Education in London and has been there since it began more than 50 years ago in 1973. I'm the only person left who was there when it started in 1973, which makes me feel incredibly old. Recently, we celebrated 50 years of this research unit, and we published this book called Social Research for Our Times. And that contains 20 chapters written by different people who have been at Thomas Coram Research Unit or are there today on our past and our present work. And I want to stress that the book, you can access it free online. It's published by University College London Press, and they have a very good policy that all their books are available free online, which is very unusual. So you can look at any bit of this book and some of the other books I will mention. And the book covers 3 sections. We have a section on services and policies for children, young people and families. The second section on family life, gender and minority communities covers issues, for example, like migration, which is a big subject today. And a third section is on innovative social research methodologies. So it might just be worth a few minutes to have a look and see if there is anything in the book that interests you. Nothing on demography, I'm afraid, but on subjects that perhaps are related to your interest. So how do I position my work? I actually have quite a number of interconnected interests. I'm interested in lots of different areas. I'm interested in education, particularly early childhood, but education more generally. I'm very interested in democratic culture and democratic culture in education. How do we bring democracy into education? I'm interested in the continental tradition of social pedagogy. Perhaps it's something that you have in your country. It's not been something that Britain has, or indeed the English-speaking world has. So I've become very interested in understanding social pedagogy as a very important discipline and profession. I'm interested in the relationship between care, employment, and gender. And that takes me into leave policies, which we'll talk about tomorrow, because that's very much about the relationship between care, employment, and gender. And I'm very interested in the workforce, the people working in care services and in education services. One of the things that interests me is today, in nearly every country I study, there is a crisis in finding people to work in care and education services, and also services for adults, elderly people. It seems to be a global problem, and we might come on to that tomorrow. And then I'm interested from a disciplinary point of view in history, that's my background, and I'm very interested in comparative studies, actually working with different countries and what that can do to help us understand these subjects. I have a confession. I am not a demographer. I am not somebody who has looked into population studies. But I hope we can make some connections, even though we have these different backgrounds. We shall see. In recent years, I'm retired, I should say, but I still work quite a lot. And in recent years, I've become increasingly interested in understanding what might be called the conditions of the times, what is going on today in the world. And in particular, I've been interested in the idea that we live at a time of polycrisis, and I'll discuss that concept in a minute, which is demanding transformative change and real utopias. And I will talk about those terms, polycrisis, real utopias. But I become increasingly aware that we live at this time of incredible crisis, and nothing we do, whether it's in demography or education, can ignore those crises. And therefore, I'm particularly interested in the role of the academy, universities, higher education, in these conditions of crisis. What is our responsibility? How do we respond to living at this very, very dangerous time? I take inspiration from the work of an ethnographer called Joseph Tobin, who's really a very, very interesting researcher in comparative education. He does really interesting comparisons between the United States, Japan, and China, for example. It's very interesting. And he talks about the role of the academy in challenging taken for granted assumptions, things that people just assume are correct. And also he talks about the academy expanding the menu of the possible. So I'll say more about this interest in a few minutes' time. But another person, just before I sign off on that for now, is a professor at University College London called Jeff Mulgan, who recently spoke in an annual lecture to the British Academy of Social Science. And he talked about the role of social sciences, and I would include demography in that, the role of social sciences in understanding, mapping, and shaping the future. Again, he's saying, what is the responsibility of the academy? And he writes, a well-intentioned focus on impact has encouraged incremental, very small work on policy, how to tweak, how to adjust, a little, ideally aligned with the interests of the government of the day, but has discouraged the serious design of how our society or economy might be a generation out. So he's saying, well, tend to look at very little minor things today rather than say in 30 years' time. What do we need to be imagining? I believe, he carries, we need to grow the spaces and places within the social sciences that expand our shared possibility space, the options for our societies. And this is what I call exploratory social science. So I suppose I've been interested in the idea of doing exploratory social science, because I think we have to think about the future and not just how we tweak, how we adjust what we have today. So in this context, the conditions of the times and the role of the academy, I want to frame the two lectures I'm going to give to you today and tomorrow. And today's menu, what's on the menu today, is 3 courses, three dishes. Firstly, I want to argue that education is a political practice. And I think you could probably put in demography instead of education. The same argument would apply, you'll see. But because I come from education, I'm going to talk about education. Argue that education is a political practice, and we should start from political questions and political choices. Secondly, I'm going to go discussing what are the conditions of the times. I mentioned that already. I'll talk more about that, develop what I've mentioned already. And thirdly, I shall argue that though the conditions of our times are very dangerous, existentially dangerous, they also open up for new possibilities, which means that we have opportunities and responsibilities to work as academics and policy makers on real utopias, which I'll discuss the meaning of that. So let me start with the first course of the menu. Education is a political practice involving political questions and political choices. So today, education, remember, I think it applies more broadly, but I talk about what I know of. So, education today is often understood as first and foremost a technical practice. It's about outcomes, it's about impact, it's about measuring performance, it's about technologies for achieving high performance. It's about asking technical questions like, what works? And a technical question is a question that should have only one correct answer. My car does not work. That's what is the matter? That is a technical question. And the person in the garage looks at my car and says, oh, this is not working. I will change it. That's a technical question. But there is an alternative way of thinking, and that is that education should be understood as first and foremost a political practice. And I want to quote here from the words of somebody called Loris Malaguzzi, who is a great Italian educational thinker and practitioner, who wrote, education is always a political discourse, whether we know it or not. It's about working with cultural choices, but it clearly also means working with political choices. Now, let me just mention a little bit about Loris Malaguzzi. He lived in Italy between 1920 and 1994, and some of you will realize that was a very turbulent period. It coincides with fascist rule, Mussolini, Second World War, and then a whole enormous social upheaval after the war, leading into the start of neoliberalism, which I'll discuss in a minute. He trained as a teacher and a psychologist, and he lived and worked in Reggio Emilia, which is a city in northern Italy near Bologna. If you geography, you can imagine. Yeah? And from the 1960s, he led the creation of a network of 50 municipal public schools for young children from 0 to 6 years. And those schools have become world famous. You go to Reggio Emilia, you will meet anytime a group of people from a country. It could be Korea, it could be Brazil, it could be South Africa, it could be Sweden. People coming there from many countries. And the exhibitions that they have created in Reggio Emilia about their education go round the world all the time. It's a very important place in education. So he's one of my education heroes. I don't know whether you have demographic heroes, but I have certain heroes in education. And 10 years ago, soon after I retired, I had the good luck to work with people from Reggio Emilia to produce a book of Loris Malaguzzi's speeches and his writings. And that was a really formative experience for me. It's really to really study what the man thought and what he did, because he was somebody who was out in schools all the time. So let's explore this idea of education as a political practice. It means that you start by asking political questions and making political choices between conflicting alternatives. Because political questions, and here I'm quoting from a political scientist, a Belgian woman called Chantal Mouffe, who actually works in London, but she's very well known in political science. And she writes, political questions are not mere technical questions to be solved by experts. Political questions always involve decisions which require us to make choices between conflicting alternatives. I have a problem with my car. It's a technical issue because probably there's one correct answer. Should I have a car is a political question, because you could have conflicting and alternative answers to that political question. So, what are political questions for education? What are the political choices? Now, what I want to offer here are my political, the ones that I think are important. And you may agree or disagree, or agree with some of them or disagree. So the point I want to make here is just because they're my questions does not mean they should be your questions. But the questions that seem to me important in education are, what is the image? What is the conception, the idea you have of the child? Who do you think the child is? Who do you think the educator, the teacher is? What's your idea? And what is your idea or image of the school? What do you think the school is? We're talking here about social construction. How do you construct an image of child, educator, and school? There are many different ways, many different images. What do we mean by education? It's a term much used, but certainly in my country, very rarely actually defined. What are the purposes of education? What's it for? Why do we educate? What do we mean by care? And how does care relate to education? What are the fundamental values of education? And what are the ethics we work with in education? And then the very big question, what do we want for our children now and in the future? Oh, and the final one, which brings me back to what I mentioned, what are the conditions of the times? Now, just give a pause for you to look at those and think perhaps whether you have other questions, but also perhaps what would be your political questions when it comes to population studies. What are the questions that should be raised for people to argue about and debate when it comes to demography and population studies? Because every discipline is confronted by the same issue. I should say that technical practice matters. It's very important how we do things, but it should follow, in my view, from political practice. You ask political questions first, you make political choices, then you ask, what do we do? How do we do it? You don't start by saying what works. How do we do that? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second course in my menu. What are the conditions of the times? And again, I'm offering you my political choices, you could say, my interpretation, my analysis. I don't expect you to share it. In fact, you will see it very differently. I'm looking at it as a rather elderly white man living in London. I don't see many people like me here. So you occupy different positions. You will see it in different way. But I want to suggest that the question, what are the conditions of the times, is relevant to all of us. And here, let me return to Loris Malaguzzi, because from the beginning of his time in Reggio Emilia, creating schools and education, he saw the conditions of the times as essential to understand. He said, our conception of pedagogy is dynamic. Either pedagogy, like all human sciences, demography included, is remade, reconstructed, and updated based on the new conditions of the times, or it loses its nature, function, and capacity to correspond to the times it lives in and to foresee, anticipate, and prepare the days of tomorrow. So he's really saying we can't just assume that any disciplinary field is kind of static. All the time we have to say, is it relevant to what is going on in the world today? Has it moved? Has it adapted? Has it responded to what is going on in the world? Or has it got stuck back 30 years ago, for example? And I suppose my analysis of the conditions of the times, and I stress you may not agree, is that we're living in what is called the world of the polycrisis. This is a term you will see quite a lot being used today. And a definition comes from the historian Adam Tooze, who's a very interesting commentator on the modern world. He says a problem becomes a crisis when it challenges our ability to cope and threatens our identity. In the polycrisis, the shocks are disparate. They may be separate, but they interact so that the whole is more overwhelming than the sum of the parts. So the point about the polycrisis is there are lots of separate crises, but they're all interacting. And that makes them much more powerful, much more dangerous than if we just look at them individually. And the seriousness of our situation, when I say our, I mean humankind, us. The seriousness of our situation is apparent from the doomsday clock, which was set this January at 89 seconds to midnight. And the doomsday clock was created in 1947. Soon after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was founded by atomic scientists, including Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. You may have seen the film recently. To warn the public how close we are to destroying our world. They knew that once science had moved to the atomic bomb, mankind was in a new world because mankind could destroy itself. This was a qualitatively different situation. And so over time, the clock has moved closer to midnight. This year, it's 89 seconds to midnight, which is the closest it has ever been to midnight, reflecting the continued state of unprecedented danger the world faces. Okay. And I want to highlight 4 of the existential crises that make up the polycrisis. I don't claim these are the only ones, but the ones that I'm particularly interested in. The first of those is one we're all familiar with, I think, the crisis of the environment, or rather the multiple plural crises on there. Global, that's strange. Oh, sorry, this is from being too clever for myself. Sorry. The first one which comes is global heating, which we're very aware of. I don't know how it has been with you. In Britain, we've just had the hottest, driest, sunniest spring on record. And last year was the hottest in the world on record. You know this. No, sorry, that's jumping the gun. Okay, a second one is, of course, pollution in all its many forms, in the sky, in the earth, in the sea. The third one is the depletion of vital resources. The soil is running out. Water is becoming increasingly fresh water short supply. And finally, the loss of biodiversity. And on my way to Prague, I was reading my newspaper. I'm sorry, I'm very old-fashioned. I read these things. And there's a big article in The Guardian. Alarm as mass insect die-offs hit world's most protected areas. And it's about the catastrophic decline in insects, even in protected environments, not just in cities, but in protected forests. The insect population around the world seems to have declined by about 70% in the last 30 years, which is very bad for insects, but disastrous for those animals that depend on insects. So this is, I suspect every day in your newspaper or online, you read the same sort of stories. This is really, really serious stuff. The second crisis, which seems to me very, very important, is the crisis of what I call science and technology. Things like nuclear weapons, which are proliferating, more and more countries, more and more weapons. AI, which of course is a huge, huge big issue. And the biologist David Orr put it very well. He said, many, if not most, of the ecological, economic, social, and psychological ailments, problems that beset contemporary society can be attributed to knowledge acquired and applied before we had time to think it through carefully. So we're producing this incredibly fast scientific and technological change, moving incredibly fast, and our ethical and political capacity to respond to it carefully and responsibly is way behind. We cannot keep up with what is going on. So we face enormous dangers from these changes. Oh, sorry, I should have clicked. The third one, which I talk about tomorrow more, is the crisis of care, which I'll talk about tomorrow in the context of leave. And the fourth one, I said, these are the things that I see as particularly important and relevant that we have to begin to think about. But you from your position, I understand you have others. Fourth one is what I would call the crisis of neoliberalism. And that is about the destructive consequences of neoliberalism and the dangerous results as a result of it declining and falling from dominance. So let me just say a bit more about that, because it's something I've written and thought about quite a lot, and I think it's really important. Okay, so what is neoliberalism? Well, people describe it in various ways. Some people say it's a thought collective, it's a whole way of thinking that has spread amongst a lot of people. A political movement, which has been very effective in shaping politicians and media and so forth. A theory that explains everything. And simply a very successful story, successful because people have actually taken it. They say, that's a good story. Yes, we can go with that. We agree with that. Just a very short history. Neoliberalism appears after the Second World War in 1947, when there's a meeting in a Swiss mountain resort called Mont Pelerin. Economists and various other people come together to discuss certain ideas about the economy and the world. And after that meeting, they form a Mont Pelerin Society, which continues today with some hundreds of people in it. And their ideas then spread through foundations, think tanks, university departments around the world, particularly in America and Britain. And then in 1973 in Chile, there is a coup d'etat led by General Pinochet. You're probably too young to remember this, but it was very important at the time. General Pinochet overthrows the government of Allende, a socialist prime minister, and imposes a military regime. And that enables people from this neoliberal group to come in and apply their ideas. But the big time, it really begins to become really important neoliberalism in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher, who you probably have heard of, and Ronald Reagan, gosh, I'm of an age where I remember them very well, but you're probably too young. They teamed up to bring the neoliberal script to the international stage. This is an economist called Kate Raworth, who's written very interestingly about sustainable economies, and very interesting writer. And the neoliberal show has been playing ever since, powerfully framing the economic debate of the past 30 years. And I said the epicenter, that the focus of this neoliberal movement has been the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, but it's spread, its ideas and its policies have spread globally through, for example, international organizations like OECD, IMF, World Bank, that sort of thing. And at the heart of neoliberalism is the idea of economization, horrible word, I'm sorry, economization, which really means the insertion, bringing economic rationality and economic ways of thinking into every part of life. The American political scientist Wendy Brown puts it like this: it's the conversion of non-economic domains, activities, and subjects into economic ones. Everything, even down to personal relationships. Who you marry, if you marry, whether to have children or not, becomes...
Who you make friends with.
Yeah, all becomes framed in terms of calculation, what you gain, what you lose, and that everything becomes. So everything becomes commodified, everything becomes something that you can buy and sell. And marketization, everything can be marketized, everything can be put into the market where it can be bought and sold, including education. And neoliberalism has prioritized certain values. In particular, competition is perhaps its absolute primary value. That is the way in which the world should work to produce the perfect results. Linked to that is individual choice. I put individual in brackets because there is such a thing as collective choice through democratic processes, but individual choice as somebody who buys a commodity, that's individual choice. And calculation, the value of constantly deciding what are the benefits, what do I lose, what's good for me, what's bad for me. And neoliberalism has this image, this idea of the ideal subject, the homo economicus, the economic man or woman who is competitive and calculating, independent and self-interested, not somebody who is dependent on other people, but somebody who becomes autonomous, an informed consumer and a flexible worker. And as Foucault put it, an entrepreneur of the self. We are constantly selling ourselves in the marketplace. And the consequences of this movement, this thought collective, has been enormous. Stephen Ball, who's one of the most distinguished scholars on neoliberalism in education and is a professor at University College London, has written, neoliberalism now configures great swathes, areas of our daily lives and structures our experience of the world. It shapes how we see the world. how we understand the way the world works, how we understand ourselves and others, how we relate to ourselves and others. We are produced by it. He would claim that neoliberalism shapes how we create our own subjectivity, how we think of ourselves. So it's profoundly and intimately effective in our lives and in our world. And the consequences of neoliberalism have been very serious and damaging. I take this quotation from a recent book by two environmentalists, George Monbiot and Peter Hutchinson. The book is called The Invisible Doctrine. And they call neoliberalism the invisible doctrine because although it is very, very powerful, most people have never heard of it. If I was to stop 10 people on the streets of London tomorrow when I go home and say, what do you think of neoliberalism? 9 out of 10 would say, what? Oh, what? I don't know what you mean. And yet neoliberalism, I and other people would argue, has had this profound effect on themselves and their world. So Monbiot and Hutchinson said, neoliberalism has caused or contributed to most of the crises that confront us. Rising inequality, offshoring, where work is sent abroad to other countries, and erosion of the tax base, epidemic diseases of despair, the slow degradation of healthcare, education, and other public services, the crumbling of infrastructure, democratic backsliding, the 2008 financial crash, the rise of modern-day demagogues, our ecological crises, and environmental disasters. And these consequences appear in education as much as anywhere else.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please do.
About the last point, about the consequences of neoliberalism. It does not seem to be a mainstream economic view of what you are presenting, and I tend to disagree. For example, if you look at the countries which have been more socially managed, centrally managed, and then strive to be socially equal, they did not succeed. And then after they started liberalizing, they started developing very rapidly. So I'm not really convinced about neoliberalism causing all of these problems. And also one thing is that from the economic theory perspective, there is no pure forms of this economic arrangement. When you can see this country is absolutely purely liberal, and this country is more managed, even say.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. The neoliberalism has affected countries in different degrees. Some have been more resistant than others. And undoubtedly, when countries that were under centralized economic systems were liberalized, there were rapid changes for quite a number of reasons. And of course, in some cases, such as Russia, it was disastrous.
But this region, for example, that's the fastest growing region in Europe, like Poland. They are the consequence of liberalization, moving from state control to...
Yeah, but it's possible, I mean, it's very possible to have various forms of capitalist organization. And I think we shouldn't necessarily assume that all forms of capitalism have these same consequences. I'm arguing that in many countries, the neoliberal form of capitalism, which is a fairly extreme form of market capitalism, has had these consequences, whereas moving from a centrally managed economy to a liberal capitalist economy wouldn't necessarily have all of these serious effects. But I would also argue that in many countries it has had these. And many countries have also been subjected to this by the influence of international organizations, which perhaps were less influential in countries like Poland. I mean, I think the IMF and World Bank, for example, went through a phase when they applied neoliberal, the Washington Consensus, very strongly in many countries with disastrous results. So I think you rightly say that it's not a blanket thing, but I think it has been very widespread on there.
And I have one more point which needs really clarification. This offshoring, when you send the jobs are sent from one country to another. I don't see why it is bad. Because, for example, in my country, in Central Asia, we are trying to integrate into global supply chain because that's the chance for us to develop. So it means necessarily, well, in most cases, lower paid jobs from developed countries would be transferring to our countries.
Well, I think it's also a question of how, first of all, how it's done. That under neoliberalism, it was often done very brutally, so that communities which used to have well-paid manufacturing jobs lost those almost overnight, with no attempt made to actually replace them with something that would substitute. So I'm not saying that it wasn't important that some manufacturing moved. It was the way it was done. I mean, if I take a very simple example from my own country, and it's not quite, but the mining industry, coal in my country, basically went in 10 years. We now import from other countries. And of course, that was necessary. We can't, but the way it was done absolutely devastated many, many, many places and left them in a terrible condition. So in a way, offshoring, I think you could say, is a shorthand for saying a callous reorganization of production, which took no concern for the people who were affected by it. And of course, we're now seeing the reaction to that, in the way a lot of the Trumpian and politics is in a rather crude form about reaction to that, the way it was done, and the way that many working class people in countryside of the West were left feeling they were being neglected, badly treated.
So just then clarify that we are not against offshoring and international division of labor,
no.
How it was done. And
it's very much how it was done,
socially.
but also I think connected with the general sense in which the globalization of capital has had negative effects, of which loss of taxation would be a related issue. So you could say the offshoring of tax has also been very detrimental to many countries, the use of tax havens and so forth. But no, I think it's very much the way it was done. In a way, the assumption of people who did it was that somehow the market will sort this out, and it didn't. And it's left millions of people feeling incredibly neglected, left behind, etc. But thank you. I think those are important clarifications. Yes.
Maybe I'll let later, but I think I didn't catch the definition of neoliberalism so far, and the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism. I had something in my mind, but
well, I think you could say that neoliberalism has much in, if you like, it's an extreme form of market liberalism. One in which there is the minimum regulation, that's very much, and one that puts enormous emphasis on individualism as opposed to any balancing of collective need. So, yeah, I would say you should think of it as some of the key elements of liberalism, like for example, the importance of the market. Now, personally, I would say markets have their place, but the question is to define what their place is. And in neoliberalism, there is, at least in some ways in which it is presented, the market is seen as being the answer to everything. You simply apply marketization. But for example, in things like water or the provision of early childhood services. In my country, virtually all services for young children are on the market and provided for profit. So that would be, and this would be true of many other services today, that they've been put in a place where there is competition between competing private services. Yeah. Okay. So, how are we up to? Okay, so in fact, there's been consequences of neoliberalism in education. Those consequences have been due to the spread of what is called the Global Education Reform Movement, or GERM for short, which is a term used by an educator from Finland called Pasi Sahlberg. And he talks about this reform movement emerging in the 1980s and being adopted as an education reform orthodoxy throughout the world. It's this way of approaching education which has become very widespread, and it has 5 main symptoms or features: very strong market logic in education, centrality of competition between students, between schools, and between countries. So you have today, for example, the OECD does an assessment of young people now in 90 countries called PISA, and the results of those are regularly produced, and you can see how your country competes with other countries. The second symptom is corporate and business management models. These are adopted by schools and by governments for education. Standardization has become a very strong theme, increasing performance standards set for pupils and schools and countries. You define very clearly what it is that each student should achieve at a certain stage. The focus on core subjects like literacy, numeracy, science, which leads to a narrowing of education, and test-based accountability, the spread of what is called high-stakes testing, where the testing is very important, for example, for the school, because the school has to perform well if it's going to succeed, and in competition with other schools. And this has affected ways of thinking about education. For example, the purpose of education, which you remember was one of the questions that I suggested. What's the purpose of education? Increasingly, the purpose of education has been defined as economic. Education always has an economic purpose, clearly, though what economy is an important question. But under GERM and the neoliberalism, then the economic purpose has become increasingly the focus. And in particular, the main goal has become human capital development, human capital theory, the idea, education about developing the individual as units of human capital, and economic competitiveness has become very central. Pedagogy, types of it, ways of learning, has focused on the transmission of predetermined information for predetermined outcomes. It's what Loris Malaguzzi talked about as prophetic pedagogy. He said this prophetic pedagogy knows everything that will happen and has no uncertainty. So what he saw happening around him as in the 1980s and 90s was this increasing emphasis on knowing exactly what everybody had to achieve by each stage of their education. And under provision, schools have often become businesses selling a commodity to parent consumers, and factories producing predefined outcomes. And in a recent series of articles, Stephen Ball, who I mentioned earlier, and his Spanish colleague, Jordi Coll-i-Sabé, write of the school as a factory of learning, a modernist institution of government set within the ontology of environmental exploitation. The school is a block, an obstacle, an inhibition to freedom, to learning, to the move to a different sort of sustainable society. We take the school to be irreparable. That Stephen Ball, and he's a very eminent scholar in this field, actually thinks the school is a disaster in terms of moving towards a sustainable world. Now, I don't agree with him myself, but he takes a very negative view of the school, having this factory of learning and being very much focused on environmental exploitation. So he's really putting the argument that we need to find new ways in which we educate. We need to move away from the institution of the school. So I don't agree with him, but it's
Just a quick question then, what is his alternative?
Well, that's a very interesting point. He thinks that we need to look at other resources and facilities in the community. I would say I think he's a bit weak on this, on the alternative. Now, that's one of the I think the school has got possibility. He doesn't, and he's not very clear to my mind on the alternative, except he seems to say that we should be working in various different resources that we have in our communities, like libraries, like museums, like sports facilities. In other words, that we move to sort of networks of community resources, and we move away from this institution, which he thinks is very, very controlling, very difficult to change. And of course, there is an idea, and schools can become very rigid and very controlling. And he says, well, that's the way they are. And it's very difficult to shift them. And as I say, I think one can see examples of schools being different. So I don't, but it's an important argument, I think, about the institutes. The tension of the school is always between emancipation and it being a place for governing the population in a way. That it's a place where it's always been part of the idea of school has been about a place where we can take rather dangerous parts of the population and make it safer. We can tame it, we can civilize it. It's been that idea of the school. Another idea has been it's a place where we open up possibilities and emancipation. It's an opening out place, and the other is about it's enclosing people into a certain way of being. So it's an interesting tension. And just if anybody wants to go into this more, I've written recently a book called Neoliberalism and Early Childhood Education with a colleague at UCL, Guy Roberts Holmes, and it's in an important book series called Contesting Early Childhood. And the aim of that series is to question the current dominant discourses surrounding early childhood and offer alternative narratives. So it's part of what I think of as a resistance movement, people who are trying to look at different ways of thinking and doing education. So neoliberalism has been a hegemonic project, albeit to different degrees and in different ways. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot. Sometimes I want to be clever and I forget to be clever. And it's achieved great influence, but it may be that we reached a turning point and we're entering a period of the decline and fall of the neoliberal order, which is the title of a book written by an American historian called Gary Gerstle, called The Decline and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. And I guess no hegemonic project, whether it is social democracy or communism or autocratic monarchy, lasts forever. And many argue that the neoliberal era is in decline. The German sociologist Jens Beckert says neoliberalism's promise has not survived the test of the real world. And today, neoliberalism's promises are largely exhausted. So there's quite a lot of people writing in this way. Some people say actually it's a mistake. It's not at all moving into decline, but there's an interesting debate going on. But even if it's true that the periods of decline of systems are very dangerous and they can add Sorry, actually. Okay. Okay. No system disappears overnight. It always leaves traces behind. You see, I imagine when the communist system broke down, it didn't just disappear in a puff of smoke. Institutions, ideas remained around. And then, as Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist leader, wrote, the old is dying, but he added the new cannot be born. So we're in this, arguably in a period where one order, neoliberalism, is dying, but we don't have a new order. And Jens Beckett says there are currently no politically strong narratives that would point to alternatives to the neoliberal logic of competition, markets, and coercion in ways guided by principles of social justice and democratic polity. And as Gramsci said, when you have this interregnum between orders, the great variety of morbid symptoms, that's his words, morbid symptoms appear, and you have the danger of even more dangerous narratives appearing, authoritarian nativist regimes, for example, which leads me to the third part of my menu, the argument that today conditions are very dangerous, but that also opens up for new possibilities and opportunities and responsibilities to work on real utopias. Oh, I'm very sorry. I want to start the section by the famous words of Milton Friedman, who some people would call the godfather of neoliberalism. He was one of the key economists who developed the ideas that led to the neoliberal movement. And he's writing in the 1960s when he had very little influence. But he wrote, only a crisis produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And you could say that Milton Friedman was doing this in the 1960s when his ideas were politically impossible, but by the 1980s, they had become politically inevitable. So his analysis of change, I think, is very important. So I'd argue that faced by the polycrisis, we need to develop alternatives that are transformative, offer transformative change, new ways of thinking and talking and doing, to work on real utopias. What do I mean by real utopias? Well, I would argue that utopian thinking is very important for provoking new ways of thinking. It's a way of developing new alternatives. And there's quite a lot of literature on utopian thinking, where people begin to imagine different ways of doing things. And the Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos describes utopian thinking as the exploration by imagination of new modes of human possibilities. So utopian thinking is exploring, imagining different ways of being. But then that's taken further by the American sociologist Eric Olin Wright. He talks about real utopias. He says, desirability is great. You need to have values, principles, goals. We need a dream. That's great. We need to imagine. But the dream must be viable and it must be achievable. It's no good dreaming without knowing how you might achieve the dream. By viability, he means you need theoretical models or case studies of examples. So you need to say, look, there is somebody who has made my dream come true. They've done it. in that place. It's a possibility. But you also need to say what conditions are needed to achieve that dream everywhere. How do you implement it? How do you make your dream come true? So let me offer briefly, very briefly, and finally, my alternatives on the 3 Ps of education, the ways that I have been thinking. You will have different ideas, I'm sure. Firstly, on the purposes of education, I've been very interested in the idea of education in its broadest sense, which is the idea of education as an emancipatory, a freedom project of holistic growth and self-formation of the individual. So it's not just about human capital or economy, it's about the whole person. And the Germans, 18th century, had this very interesting concept of Bildung for education. It's the idea that the individual with other people constructs herself into something not decided beforehand. You don't know what the person will become. They work on becoming. It's an active undertaking which implies an increase in the individual's possibilities for freedom. So it's a very, say, emancipatory project. Sorry, I should have put that up. But the purposes of education, I would argue, are not only for the individual, but they're also about society and the environment. For example, I would see the purposes of education being about building and maintaining a democratic culture. There's a very long tradition in education of education being about democratic values and practice. It's about making democracy a value and practice in education, making education a lived experience of democracy. Education can be about building and maintaining a more caring society, creating a synergy between education and care. So you have education inscribed with an ethics of care. I'll talk about that tomorrow. And you can think about education as being about building and maintaining a sustainable environment. There's a lot of work today about education for sustainable futures, environmental sustainability, recognizing our responsibility for an interdependence with the non-human world. On pedagogy, I turn away from Malaguzzi's prophetic pedagogy towards a pedagogy that values wonder and surprise, curiosity and uncertainty, experimentation and the unexpected, creativity and co-construction of meaning. This could be a pedagogy of what is called relationships and listening, which we find in Reggio Emilia. And that's the idea of knowledge as a process of construction by individuals' relation with others, a true act of co-construction, writes Carlina Rinaldi from Reggio Emilia. And another idea is of slow pedagogy, like slow food, slow pedagogy. Oh, dear.
Slide doesn't correspond to.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just seeing everything I hit myself. I am very sorry about that. I need a mirror on there. So these are different ideas. Prophetic pedagogy knows exactly where you have to be and where you're going and what the final point is. Pedagogy, relation and listening is about a pedagogy where you are constructing knowledge with other people, you're meaning making, emphasizes wonder and surprise, not knowing, pursuing things that are new and open, experimenting, being creative. Slow pedagogy is about complexity, interconnectedness, where there is time for the unexpected and local knowledge. So these are different ideas about pedagogy. And it's a very interesting book if you're interested in this idea by my colleague Alison Clark called Slow Knowledge and the Unhurried Child, which is all about what slow pedagogy. There's a book called The Slow Professor as well, which appeals to me. I mean, this is part of a much bigger movement, the slow movement. It's about generally having more time in life to think, reflect, to not know, to be uncertain. And in her book, Alison writes about slow pedagogy being attentive to the rhythms of the child, allowing rapid moments, but also slowing down, making time to listen and collaborate, celebrating the group as well as the individual, etc., etc. And finally, when it comes to provision, I would turn away from the school as a sort of factory, a production line, to the school as a public space or a forum for all citizens, young and old, and I would treat children as well as adults as citizens with rights, where they can participate in many, many projects, social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental. So projects like education, but then I've said, what do we mean by education? One project is to discuss what we mean by education. Projects like fostering solidarity in the community, inclusion in the community, welfare, respect for diversity, environmental sustainability, and democratic practice. So all these are projects that schools as public spaces can promote. Creating culture. So Loris Malaguzzi saw his schools as changing the culture of their communities, changing how their communities thought about children. So their role was to have that effect on the wider population. And participating in building an educating society. So where the school is not the only place for education, coming back to this question of the future of the school. School, I think, should not be the only place for education, but that doesn't mean thinking about an educating society. Okay, so I've been arguing the need for creating real educational utopias, and I've offered some desirable features of a utopian education. I've demonstrated or touched on the viability in schools for young children in Reggio Emilia. There are many examples of schools and educational experiences which work in these sorts of ways. There's a bigger question of what conditions we need to achieve a different sort of education. I would say, people may not agree, dismantling neoliberalism, the ideology, a well-educated workforce. We need teachers who are intellectuals, for example. Malaguzzi was very clear. We need human-scale schools, smaller schools in which relationships can have a much more important role. Very competent or strong education, support systems, etc. And there will be other ones. So, my final slide, and to conclude. In the lecture, I've argued that at a time of polycrisis and transition, we have a responsibility to analyze the conditions of the times and to work within disciplines and across them to populate our fuzzy pictures of the future with complex, rich, plausible ideas. So this is my colleague at UCL, Jeff Mulgan, again, arguing social science needs to work on the future and produce clearer ideas of possibilities. I suggested that real utopias are one approach to doing this by linking desirability, viability, and achievability. And I've offered an example in education focusing on desirability, but backed by viability and achievability.